November 3rd, 1943, 0540 hours. Fighter Dispersal Area, Rabaul Airfield, New Britain. Sub-Lieutenant Saburō Sakai pressed his palm against the warm metal skin of his Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter, feeling the engine heat dissipate into the pre-dawn tropical air. Around him in the darkness, mechanics worked with practiced silence, preparing 17 Zeros for the morning's interception mission. American bombers were coming. They always came now, and Sakai's squadron would rise to meet them as they had every day for the past 3 months. Sakai-san, Flight Petty Officer Kenji Okabe approached from the operations tent, his boots crunching on the coral gravel. The younger pilot had graduated from flight training just 6 months ago, one of the new replacements that arrived weekly now to fill the holes in squadrons that had once been the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The briefing officer says we'll face at least 40 Corsairs escorting the bombers. He estimates we're outnumbered 3-1. Sakai nodded without looking up from his pre-flight inspection. 3-1 was actually better odds than yesterday, when they'd faced 5 American fighters for every Japanese Zero. How many hours do you have in type, Okabe-san? 120 hours total, sir. 50 in the Zero. And how many combat sorties? This will be my 8th, sir. Sakai finally looked at the young pilot, seeing the mixture of eagerness and fear that he remembered from his own early combat days in China, back when the world was simpler and Japanese pilots dominated the sky through superior training and equipment. That was 1938, 5 years ago, though it felt like a lifetime. Back then, Sakai had trained for 2 years before his first combat mission. He'd accumulated 300 hours of flight time, including intensive dogfighting practice against experienced instructors. He'd learned aerobatics until he could fly the aircraft as naturally as walking, until the Zero became an extension of his own body. Okabe had 120 hours total, 50 in type, 8 combat missions, and he was considered lucky. Many of the new pilots arriving at Rabaul had barely 60 hours total flight time, thrust into combat against American pilots who seemed to have limitless training, limitless fuel for practice, limitless everything. Stay close to me today, Sakai instructed. When the Americans attack, don't try to dogfight them one-on-one unless you have no choice. The Corsairs are heavier, faster in a dive, and they fight in pairs. If you try to turn with one, his wingman will kill you. Hi, Sakai-san. The briefing was held in a sweltering tent where 17 pilots gathered around a map table illuminated by kerosene lamps. Lieutenant Commander Masahisa Saito, the squadron's new commanding officer, stood at the head of the table. He was the 4th CO Sakai had served under at Rabaul. The first 3 were dead. Intelligence reports a large formation of B-25 bombers approaching from the southeast, Saito began, his voice carrying the flat tone of a man reciting information he'd delivered dozens of times before. Estimated 40 to 50 bombers with fighter escort. We'll have 17 Zeros. Our objective is to break up the bomber formation before they can strike our shipping in Simpson Harbor. One of the pilots, a young flight warrant officer named Hiroshi Nishizawa, no relation to the famous ace, raised his hand hesitantly. Sir, how do the Americans always know when we're airborne? Their fighters always seem positioned perfectly to intercept us before we can reach the bombers. Saito's expression darkened. We believe they have some form of detection equipment. Our intelligence officers are investigating. He didn't say what everyone in the tent knew, that American radar could detect Japanese aircraft over 100 miles away, giving them time to position their fighters perfectly for every intercept. Japanese radar technology lagged far behind, and what few sets they possessed were primitive by comparison. The briefing continued with weather information, radio frequencies, and emergency procedures. Sakai listened with half his attention, having heard it all before. His mind wandered to the previous day's combat, to the 4 American corsairs he'd engaged over Bougainville. He'd managed to damage one, maybe get a kill, though confirmation was impossible in the chaos of modern air combat. But he'd also watched as 3 new Japanese pilots were shot down in less than 2 minutes. 3 pilots who'd trained for months, flown halfway across the Pacific, only to die in their first real dogfight. The mathematics of replacement were becoming impossible to ignore. Every week, new American pilots appeared over Rabaul, fresh, well-trained, flying new aircraft. Every week, Japanese pilots died or were wounded. The replacements who arrived from Japan were younger, less trained, more likely to die quickly. It was a death spiral that no amount of individual skill could stop. At 06:20 hours, Sakai climbed into his Zero's cockpit, running through the startup procedure with the muscle memory of 5 years' experience. The Sakai engine caught on the 3rd blade, settling into the familiar rough idle that characterized the Nakajima radial. Around him, other Zeros were starting up, their engines creating a cacophony that rolled across the airfield like thunder. Sakai's aircraft, tail number 51132, bore the scars of 3 years of combat. Patches covered bullet holes in the wings. The paint was faded and chipped. The canopy glass was scratched from months of tropical sun and salt air. But the engine ran smoothly. The controls responded crisply, and the twin 20mm cannons and 2 7.7mm machine guns were loaded and ready. This Zero had brought him home from dozens of combats. He trusted it more than he trusted the new aircraft arriving from Japan, which seemed to have more mechanical problems with each passing month. The formation took off in pairs, 17 Zeros climbing into the pink dawn sky. Sakai led his section, himself and Okabe, on the right wing of the main formation. They climbed to 18,000 feet, heading southeast toward the reported bomber track. The morning air was smooth, the visibility unlimited. A beautiful day for dying, Sakai thought without humor. At 07:02 hours, the radio crackled with the first sighting report. Many aircraft, bearing 120, distance 30 kilometers, altitude 5,000 meters. Sakai scanned the sky ahead, his eyes trained through years of combat to spot the tiny specks of distant aircraft before they resolved into identifiable shapes. There, a dark mass on the horizon, growing larger as the distances closed. The American bombers, flying in their typical tight formation, stacked in elements of 3, presenting overlapping fields of defensive fire. And above them, like sharks circling wounded prey, at least 50 American fighters. Sakai counted quickly. Corsairs, the new gull-winged monsters that combined speed, firepower, and durability in ways the older Wildcats never had. 50 Corsairs against 17 Zeros, 3-to-1 odds. All aircraft, this is Saito, will dive through the fighters and attack the bombers from ahead. Concentrate your fire and don't get drawn into extended dogfights with the escort. The commander's orders were tactically sound, but practically impossible. You couldn't simply dive through 50 enemy fighters and expect to reach the bombers unmolested. Sakai keyed his microphone. Okabe, stay with me. When we dive, keep your speed up. Don't slow down to aim carefully. Fire a burst and keep moving. Hi, Sakai-san. The Zeros rolled into their attack dive, 17 fighters plunging toward the American formation. Sakai felt the familiar acceleration pressing him into his seat. The airspeed indicator climbing past 300 knots as the Zero's light weight and clean design converted altitude into velocity. For a moment, it felt like the old days, when Japanese fighters could dictate the terms of engagement, when American pilots learned to fear the Zero's legendary maneuverability. Then the Corsairs dropped on them from above. The Americans had been waiting, positioned perfectly by their radar controllers, diving from superior altitude with the sun behind them. Sakai saw them coming and hauled his Zero into a hard right turn, the G-forces graying his vision at the edges. Tracers arced past his canopy, 6 streams of 50 caliber bullets from a Corsair that had picked him as a target. The American fighter flashed past, too fast to follow, climbing back to altitude for another pass. "Brake! Brake!" voices screamed over the radio. Sakai saw 2 Zeros explode in mid-air, hit by the concentrated firepower of multiple Corsairs. A third Zero was spinning downward, trailing smoke, its pilot either dead or unconscious. 3 fighters gone in the first 10 seconds of combat. Okabe was still with him, glued to his wing with the determination of a pilot who knew his only chance of survival was staying close to an experienced leader. Sakai leveled out at 12,000 feet, searching for targets, searching for any tactical advantage in the swirling dogfight that had erupted around them. A lone B-25 bomber had become separated from the main formation, probably after taking damage from another Zero's attack. Sakai pointed his nose toward it, lining up for a frontal pass. The B-25's nose guns opened fire, 5 50 caliber machine guns creating a cone of fire that any sane pilot would avoid. Sakai flew straight through it, firing his 20mm cannons in 2-second bursts, seeing his shells impact the bomber's left engine. Then a Corsair was on him, appearing from nowhere with the speed and suddenness that characterized American fighter tactics. Sakai broke hard left, pulling the Zero through a turn so tight his vision tunneled to a small point. The Corsair tried to follow, but couldn't match the Zero's turn radius. Sakai completed his turn and found himself briefly behind the American fighter, a perfect deflection shot. His 20mm cannon roared twice. Both shells missed. The Corsair accelerated away with power the Zero couldn't match, climbing back to altitude where its advantages were greatest. Sakai didn't chase. Chasing fast American fighters was how young Japanese pilots died. "Sakai-san, I can't shake him." Okabe's panicked voice came over the radio. Sakai snap-rolled his Zero and saw Okabe in a desperate spiral dive with a Corsair following, matching every maneuver, closing the distance, preparing for the killing shot. Sakai pushed his throttle to full power and dove, hoping to reach Okabe before the Americans' guns finished their work. He was 10 seconds too late. The Corsair's 6 machine guns fired a single long burst. Okabe's Zero came apart in the air, the wings folding upward from the concentrated impact of 50 caliber bullets designed to kill bombers. No parachute appeared from the fireball. Okabe was gone. His 8 combat missions and 120 hours of training erased in the time it took an American pilot to hold down his trigger for 3 seconds. Sakai fired at the Corsair more in anger than with any expectation of hitting it. The American pilot saw the tracers, broke hard right, and was gone, disappearing into the clouds with the casual ease of a pilot who knew he had the faster aircraft and could disengage whenever he chose. The combat lasted 23 minutes. When Saito finally called the survivors to regroup and return to base, Sakai counted 9 Zeros forming up around him. 9 out of 17. 8 aircraft lost. 8 pilots dead or missing. For what? The bomber formation had continued to their target, protected by their escort. Japanese anti-aircraft fire might shoot down 1 or 2 bombers, but the rest would destroy their targets. then returned safely to their bases where new aircraft and new crews waited to replace any losses. And tomorrow, the Americans would come again. And the day after that. And the day after that. An endless stream of bombers and fighters backed by an industrial machine that seemed to produce aircraft faster than Japan could destroy them, and pilots trained well enough to use those aircraft effectively. The landing at Rabaul was somber. Sakai taxied his Zero to the dispersal area and shut down the engine, sitting in the cockpit for a moment as ground crew rushed to rearm and refuel the aircraft for the next mission. His hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline crash that always followed combat. He was 31 years old and felt like 60. Climbing out of the cockpit, Sakai walked to the operations tent to file his combat report. Lieutenant Commander Saito was already there, his face drawn and exhausted. 8 pilots lost in a single mission. The squadron was being ground down, attrited to nothing by the sheer weight of American numbers. "We claimed 6 bombers destroyed and 4 fighters," Saito said, reading from the preliminary reports filed by returning pilots. "Intelligence will verify the claims." Sakai knew what verification would show. Maybe 2 bombers actually destroyed, possibly 1 fighter. Japanese pilots, desperate for victories that might justify the losses, often claimed multiple kills in the confusion of combat. The Americans did the same, but they had enough pilots that overclaiming didn't matter. When they lost 20 pilots in a week, 50 replacements arrived. When Japan lost 20 pilots in a week, maybe 5 replacements arrived, and those 5 had a fraction of the training the lost pilots possessed. "Sakai-san," Saito said quietly. "Walk with me." They left the operations tent and walked toward the edge of the airfield, where palm trees provided shade from the tropical sun. In the distance, construction crews were filling bomb craters from yesterday's raid, a task that never ended because the bombs never stopped coming. "You've been at Rabaul for 4 months now," Saito began. "You've flown how many combat sorties?" 93 since arriving here, sir. Over 200 total since China. "And how many Americans have you shot down?" Sakai considered the question carefully. Claims versus confirmed kills versus actual kills were 3 different numbers. Confirmed, 28. Probable kills, perhaps a dozen more. Actual number? I don't know, sir. Combat is chaos. Saito nodded. "You're one of our best pilots. You've survived engagements that killed lesser men. You have the Emperor's gratitude and the respect of every pilot in this squadron." He paused. "But you're exhausted. I can see it. How long before even Saburō Sakai makes the mistake that gets him killed?" "Sir, Let me finish." Saito's voice was gentle but firm. "Every week we shoot down American aircraft. Every week we claim victories. And every week, more Americans appear than we shot down the week before. Where are they coming from? How many pilots does America have?" Sakai had no answer. The question haunted him every night, lying in his bunk listening to distant air raid sirens. How many American pilots? How many more aircraft? When would the mathematics shift in Japan's favor? Or was defeat inevitable? Just a matter of time before the weight of American production and training simply crushed Japanese resistance through sheer attrition. "I've seen intelligence reports," Saito continued, "that I'm not supposed to discuss with anyone below staff level. But you've earned the right to know the truth." He pulled out a folded paper from his pocket. "American pilot training numbers. These are from captured documents and interrogated POWs, verified by multiple sources." Sakai unfolded the paper and read by the fading afternoon light. The numbers seemed impossible at first. so absurd that he read them 3 times to make sure he understood correctly. United States Navy pilot training graduates, 1942, 10,069 pilots. 1943, 20,842 pilots. 1944, projected, 21,000 plus pilots. Average training time before combat assignment, 525 flight hours. Average training time. In combat aircraft, 200 plus hours. Japanese Naval Air Force pilot training. Graduates, 1941. Approximately 1,500 pilots. 1942. Approximately 2,400 pilots. 1943. Estimated. 3,000 pilots average training time before combat assignment. 275 hours, declining to 100 hours by late 1943. Sakai stared at the numbers, his mind struggling to process their implications. In 1943 alone, America had trained 20,000 pilots, nearly 8 times more than Japan's entire output. And those American pilots arrived with 2 to 3 times the flight hours of their Japanese counterparts. "But this can't be right," Sakai said. "How can they train so many? Where do they get the instructors, the aircraft, the fuel?" "They have all of it," Saito replied simply. "Unlimited resources, unlimited industrial capacity, and they're using it." He took the paper back and replaced it in his pocket. "We shoot them down every week. You personally have killed dozens of American pilots, and they come by the hundreds to replace the dozens. That's the war we're fighting." The mathematics were merciless. The conclusion was inescapable, and standing at the edge of Rabaul airfield that November afternoon, watching ground crews prepare zeros for tomorrow's mission, Sakai understood what many Japanese naval aviators were beginning to accept, but none dared say aloud. They were fighting an enemy that replaced pilots faster than Japan could kill them. An enemy whose training programs graduated more pilots in 1 year than Japan trained in the entire war. An enemy whose industrial capacity produced aircraft so quickly that shooting down 100 bombers barely dented their strength. Admiral Yamamoto had been right. Japan might win individual battles, might produce superior aces, might develop excellent aircraft and tactics. But in a long war against American industrial might, courage and skill couldn't overcome mathematics. And the mathematics were written in the bodies of 8 pilots who wouldn't return to base that evening, replaced tomorrow by Americans who wouldn't stop coming. Couldn't stop coming, because America trained pilots the way it built automobiles, in numbers that defied Japanese comprehension. Sakai looked up at the evening sky where tomorrow's battle would be fought, and for the first time in his combat career, he wondered not if he would survive, but how long any of them would survive against an enemy whose pilot training pipeline alone guaranteed eventual victory. The disparity in pilot training that would eventually overwhelm Japanese naval aviation began not in 1941, but in the late 1930s, when the United States Navy made a fundamental philosophical decision that would determine the outcome of the Pacific Air War, where Japan chose to train a small number of supremely skilled pilots through brutal selection and years of intensive instruction. America chose to train large numbers of competent pilots through standardized, systematic programs that emphasized teamwork over individual brilliance. In 1937, the Imperial Japanese Navy graduated approximately 70 pilots from its most selective program, the Pilot Trainee System. Out of 1,500 sailors who applied, only 70 were accepted into training. Of those 70, 25 graduated, a selection rate so stringent that it guaranteed exceptional quality but catastrophically low numbers. Those 25 pilots received 2 full years of training, accumulating over 300 hours of flight time before their first combat assignment. They could perform aerobatics that bordered on the impossible, engage in dogfights that required split-second timing, and fly their aircraft to the absolute limits of their performance envelope. That same year, 1937, the United States Army Air Corps graduated 184 pilots from advanced training. The number seemed modest compared to what would come, but the American program had a crucial difference. It was designed to expand. The training infrastructure, the instructor cadre, the aircraft production, all were built with scalability in mind. When war came, America wouldn't need to create a new training system. It would simply need to feed more students into a machine already designed for mass production. Commander Richard Whiting stood in the administration building at Naval Air Station Pensacola in February 1939, reviewing expansion plans that would have seemed fantastical just 2 years earlier. Pensacola, dubbed the Annapolis of the Air, had been training naval aviators since 1914, but never at the scale now being contemplated. We're proposing to increase output from 500 graduates annually to 5,000, Lieutenant James Flatley said, spreading architectural drawings across Whiting's desk. New barracks, additional flight lines, more training aircraft. We'll need to establish auxiliary fields throughout Florida and Alabama to handle the volume. Whiting studied the plans with the skepticism of a career naval officer who'd seen ambitious projects fail. 5,000 pilots annually? Where will we get the instructors? Each student needs individual attention during basic flight training. We're standardizing everything, Flatley explained. Look at these training syllabi. Every instructor will teach the same lessons in the same sequence using the same aircraft. A student starting training in January will receive identical instruction to a student starting in July. We eliminate individual instructor variations. But flying isn't assembly line work, Whiting protested. Each student learns at different rates, has different strengths and weaknesses. Then they fail out, Flatley said bluntly. Sir, the Japanese train perhaps 1,500 pilots annually across all their programs, and most of those wash out. We're going to train 5,000, then 10,000, then 20,000 if necessary. Some will be brilliant. Most will be competent. A few will barely meet minimum standards. But they'll all be trained to fight as a team, and there will be enough of them to win through numbers, if not through individual skill. The philosophy was un-American in its acceptance of mediocrity, yet absolutely American in its faith that quantity and standardization could overcome any qualitative advantage, and the numbers would prove flatly correct. By 1940, the aviation cadet program had been restructured to accept any unmarried man between 18 and 26 who had completed at least 2 years of college. The physical standards were strict, but not impossible. 20 was 20/20 vision, no color blindness, excellent coordination. Candidates took a battery of tests measuring mathematical ability, spatial reasoning, and psychological fitness. Those who passed entered a training pipeline that would take approximately 1 year from enlistment to wings. The program began with pre-flight school, 8 weeks of intensive military indoctrination, physical conditioning, and ground school academics. Students learned navigation, meteorology, aircraft recognition, naval customs, and the theory of flight. They swam, ran, drilled, and conditioned their bodies for the physical demands of aerial combat. The washout rate here was approximately 20%. Men who couldn't handle the academic load, failed the physical requirements, or simply couldn't adapt to military discipline. Those who survived moved to primary flight training, conducted at civilian contract schools scattered across the South. Here they flew the N-3N Yellow Peril biplane, a forgiving aircraft that revealed which students possessed the coordination and instinct for flight. Instructor pilots sat behind students in the open cockpit, shouting instructions over the wind and engine noise. Ensign Robert Duncan, who would later shoot down Lieutenant Abe's torpedo bomber at the Philippine Sea, remembered his primary training at Corpus Christi in early 1943. My instructor was a civilian pilot named Jack Morrison, a crop duster from Oklahoma who'd been flying since the 1920s. He gave me the stick after my third flight and said, "Try not to kill us both." I bounced that Yellow Peril across the field like a kangaroo. Morrison just laughed and said, "Everyone does that. Now try again, and this time flare before the wheels touch." The instruction was standardized, but not impersonal. Good instructors recognized that different students needed different approaches. Some responded to encouragement, others to criticism, still others to competitive challenges. But all followed the same syllabus: takeoffs, landings, climbs, turns, stalls, spins, emergency procedures. Solo flight came after approximately 13 hours of dual instruction. Students who couldn't solo by 15 hours washed out. Primary training lasted 10 weeks and eliminated another 20% of students. Those who remained moved to basic flight training, where they flew the more complex SNJ Texan, a powerful single-engine trainer that introduced students to higher speeds, retractable landing gear, and instrument flying. Lieutenant Commander Paul Holmberg, instructing at Naval Air Station Jacksonville in 1943, described the basic phase. The SNJ separated the natural pilots from those who'd just learned to fly the Yellow Peril. It was faster, heavier, less forgiving of mistakes. Students learned formation flying, night flying, and instrument work. We also introduced gunnery. They towed targets behind other aircraft, and students fired at them with synchronized cameras. It taught deflection shooting, the hardest skill in air combat. The Japanese approach to gunnery training was fundamentally different. Japanese instructors emphasized individual marksmanship to the point where pilots spent months perfecting deflection shots against maneuvering targets. American training accepted that most pilots would be mediocre shots, so they taught tactics that brought multiple guns to bear simultaneously. The THAC weave, mutual support, coordinated attacks. Where one Japanese pilot might achieve brilliant individual results, two American pilots working as a team could achieve consistently good results. Advanced flight training divided students by specialty: fighters, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, or patrol aircraft. Fighter students, like those who would eventually face Sakai over Rabaul, learned the F-4F Wildcat, or later the F-6F Hellcat. They practiced dogfighting against instructors who'd seen combat, learning not how to execute perfect aerobatics, but how to stay alive long enough to shoot enemy aircraft. Commander David McCampbell, who would become the Navy's top ace with 34 kills, instructed advanced fighter students in early 1944. I told them the same thing every class: forget the fancy flying. The Zero can outturn you, outclimb you at low altitude, and outmaneuver you in any slow-speed fight. So don't fight slow and don't turn. Use your speed, use your dive performance, use your wingman. Come in fast, shoot, get out fast. If you try to dogfight a Zero like it's 1917 and you're in a Sopwith Camel, you'll die impressed by how well the Japanese pilot flies. The contrast with Japanese training was stark. Japanese instructors taught their students to master aerobatics, to push their aircraft to absolute limits, to win through superior individual skill. This produced exceptional pilots like Sakai, Nishizawa, and Iwamoto, aces who could dominate any one-on-one engagement. But it also produced a training pipeline that couldn't scale up to meet wartime demands. The numbers told the story of two divergent philosophies. In 1942, as the Pacific War intensified, the United States Navy graduated 10,869 pilots, nearly 5 times Japan's output. Each American graduate had approximately 305 hours of flight time, with fighter pilots receiving additional training in gunnery and tactics. The training took roughly 1 year from enlistment to operational assignment. Japan that same year graduated approximately 2,400 pilots across all programs. Each graduate had approximately 275 hours of flight time, though the most elite pilots had significantly more. The training took 2 years minimum, sometimes longer. The quality of individual Japanese pilots was higher. The quantity was catastrophically insufficient. By 1943, American production had reached its stride. The Navy commissioned new training fields across the Southeast: Corpus Christi, Pensacola, Jacksonville, Miami, Memphis, and dozens of auxiliary fields. The Army Air Forces operated parallel programs graduating even more pilots. Together, American military aviation trained over 40,000 pilots in 1943 alone. Japan trained approximately 3,000 pilots that year, and the training time had dropped to 100 to 120 hours for many programs as fuel shortages, instructor casualties, and desperate need for replacements forced compromises in quality. The gap was widening with every month of the war. But numbers alone didn't explain American dominance. The training philosophy produced pilots who understood they were part of a system, not individual warriors. Flight Lieutenant Philip Torrey, describing his advanced training at Miami in 1943, captured the difference. Our instructors hammered teamwork constantly. Never fight alone, never leave your wingman. If your buddy is in trouble, you help him even if it means missing a kill. The Japanese supposedly trained their pilots to seek glory through individual combat. We were trained to win through mutual support. Less romantic, but more effective. The replacement air group system, established in 1943, added another layer of preparation. New pilots didn't go straight from training to combat. They spent weeks in RAG units, flying the actual aircraft they'd operate in combat, practicing tactics against experienced opponents, learning from pilots who'd survived combat tours. By the time they reached the Pacific, American pilots had 525 hours or more of flight time, over 5 times what late-war Japanese pilots possessed. The Japanese couldn't replicate this system even if they'd wanted to. Fuel shortages meant training flights were limited. Experienced pilots were kept in combat units where they eventually died, rather than being rotated to training commands to pass on their knowledge. Aircraft production couldn't keep pace with training needs, so students flew worn-out trainers that broke down constantly. And the fundamental philosophy, that only the best should fly, meant that Japan continued selecting tiny numbers of highly skilled pilots when what they needed was large numbers of adequately trained pilots. Chief Aviation Pilot Toshio Sakamoto, an instructor at Kasumigaura Air Base in 1943, saw the problem firsthand. We had 40 students in my training class. By Japanese standards, that was a large class. We'd usually train 15 to 20. But we had fuel for only 10 hours of flight training per month per student. 10 hours. In peacetime, students flew 20 hours weekly. How could I teach them to fly and fight on 10 hours monthly? The American training machine, by contrast, operated without resource constraints. Students flew until they mastered each skill, not until the fuel ration ran out. If an aircraft broke down, another was available immediately. If an instructor was lost to combat, 2 more were trained to replace him. The entire system was designed for resilience, redundancy, and continuous operation. By late 1943, American pilots arriving in the Pacific had standardized training in formation flying, radio discipline, gunnery, navigation, and tactics. They understood radar-directed fighter intercepts, coordinate attacks, mutual support techniques, and emergency procedures. They'd fired thousands of practice rounds at towed targets. They'd flown in weather, at night, and in formations so tight that wingtips nearly touched. Japanese pilots arriving at forward bases like Rabaul had perhaps 100 hours total flight time if they were lucky, minimal gunnery training due to ammunition shortages, and traditional dogfighting instruction that emphasized individual combat skills. They were being sent to fight a modern, systematic air war with training designed for a previous era of aerial combat. The mathematical inevitability was clear to anyone willing to examine the numbers. America was training 20,000 pilots annually by 1943 and could expand further if needed. Japan was training 3,000 pilots annually and couldn't expand due to resource constraints. American pilot quality was good and improving. Japanese pilot quality was declining from excellent to barely adequate. American losses could be replaced within weeks. Japanese losses were irreplaceable. Sakai, with his 300-plus hours of pre-war training and 5 years of combat experience, represented the old Japanese system at its finest. Superbly trained, tactically brilliant, capable of defeating multiple opponents through skill alone. But he was an exception, not the rule. And he was fighting an enemy that didn't need exceptions. America needed competent pilots who followed doctrine, supported their teammates, and showed up in numbers that overwhelmed any individual brilliance. The training disparity would manifest most dramatically in the air battles of 1944, where American pilots with 525 hours of training would face Japanese pilots with 100 hours or less. The outcome wasn't determined by courage. Both sides had brave men. It wasn't determined by aircraft quality. Late-war American fighters were superior, but the Zero remained dangerous in skilled hands. It was determined by the simple mathematics of training time multiplied by production numbers. America could afford to lose good pilots and still win through volume. Japan couldn't afford to lose any pilots, even mediocre ones, because there weren't enough replacements. And in a war of attrition, that difference meant everything. The system that produced this disparity wasn't created in 1941 when war began. It was created in the late 1930s when American planners made a conscious choice to build training infrastructure that could scale. By the time Sakai stood on Rabaul Airfield in November 1943, watching ground crews prepare for tomorrow's mission, the war was already lost. Lost not through any failure of Japanese courage or skill, but through the simple mathematics of American pilot training programs that graduated more aviators in 1 year than Japan could train in the entire war. The mission brief on December 7, 1943, exactly 2 years after Pearl Harbor, called for 18 Zeros to intercept a strike package of 30 SBD Dauntless dive bombers attacking Japanese shipping in Simpson Harbor. Intelligence estimated 40 Hellcat fighters as escort. Lieutenant Commander Saito assigned Sakai to lead the 2nd Division, flying with 3 younger pilots. Flight Petty Officer Kenji Okabe, who'd survived his first month of combat through a combination of luck and staying glued to Sakai's wing. Seaman First Class Hiroshi Tanaka, with barely 80 hours total flight time, and Flight Warrant Officer Masao Yamamoto, a veteran of 3 months who was considered experienced by late 1943 standards. They took off at 1340 hours, climbing through scattered clouds into the brilliant blue sky of the South Pacific. Sakai's Zero, number 51-132, carried full ammunition, 120 rounds for each 20mm cannon, 680 rounds for each 7.7mm machine gun. He'd calculated that he could fire his cannons for approximately 15 seconds before exhausting the ammunition. 15 seconds to kill as many Americans as possible before becoming just another target. At 15,000 feet, climbing through thin cirrus clouds, Sakai spotted the American formation. Many aircraft, bearing 180, altitude 4,000 meters, he transmitted, falling back on the formal reporting style drilled into him during his years of training. I count approximately 30 dive bombers in sections of 3, stacked in elements. Escort fighters positioned high and forward, approximately 40 aircraft. All divisions, this is Saito, the commander's voice crackled over the radio. First Division will engage the escort. Second and third divisions will attack the bombers. Execute. The Zero formations split, with Saito leading 8 fighters to intercept the Hellcats, while Sakai's division and another 4-plane section dove toward the dive bombers. The Americans had seen them coming. Of course they had. Their radar gave them eyes beyond the horizon, and the Hellcat formation was already turning to meet the threat. Second Division, stay together, Sakai transmitted. We'll make one pass through the bombers, then break high and regroup. Don't get drawn into turning fights with the escort. Hi, Sakai-san, 3 voices acknowledged. Sakai rolled inverted and pulled through into a diving attack, his 3 wingmen following in formation. The dive began at 15,000 feet, the airspeed indicator climbing past 350 knots as the Zero's clean design and lightweight converted altitude into velocity. The SBD formation grew larger in his windscreen, the distinctive stub-nosed dive bombers flying in their defensive formation with overlapping fields of fire. He picked his target, a dive bomber in the second element, slightly behind and to the right of the leader. The pilot wouldn't see him coming until too late. Sakai's thumb rested on the firing button, his eyes calculating deflection, distance, closure rate, with the instinct of 5 years combat experience. At 800 yards, the SBD's rear gunner opened fire. Sakai saw the tracers arcing toward him, lazy-looking from this distance but traveling at nearly 3,000 feet per second. He jinked slightly right, then back left, not enough to spoil his aim, but enough to make the gunner's tracking solution more difficult. At 400 yards, Sakai pressed the trigger. Both 20mm cannons fired, their slower rate of fire creating a distinctive boom-boom-boom rhythm that Sakai could feel through the control stick. The 7.7mm machine guns added their higher-pitched chatter. He walked the fire across the SBD's left wing, seeing pieces of aluminum skin tear away, seeing his shells punch through the dive bomber's structure. The SBD's left aileron disintegrated. The aircraft rolled left uncontrollably, falling out of formation. Sakai flashed past at over 400 knots, pulling up and away from the dive bomber formation before their collective defensive fire could find him. Behind him, he heard Okabe's excited voice. "Hit! I got hits on mine!" Then Tanaka screamed. Sakai snap-rolled his Zero and looked back. A Hellcat had come through from above, probably diving from 20,000 feet, and had caught Tanaka's Zero in a high-deflection shot. The young pilot's aircraft was streaming white smoke from the engine, coolant or hydraulic fluid. Sakai couldn't tell which. Tanaka was trying to turn away, but the Hellcat pilot was staying with him, positioning for another burst. "Tanaka, dive for the clouds!" Sakai shouted, already reversing his turn to help. But he was 3,000 feet away, and the Hellcat was right there, its 650 caliber machine guns firing again. This time the burst was perfect. Tanaka's Zero shuddered, rolled inverted, and began the long spiral toward the ocean 20,000 feet below. No parachute appeared. The Hellcat pilot didn't watch his kill. He was already climbing back to altitude, where his aircraft's superior power and speed gave him maximum advantage. Sakai tried to follow, but the Hellcat simply outclimbed him, accelerating away with casual ease. "Reform on me," Sakai transmitted to his remaining two wingmen. "Stay together. We're outnumbered, and they have altitude advantage." The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Above him, Saito's 8 Zeros were engaged in a swirling dogfight with 40 Hellcats. The Americans weren't trying to dogfight. They'd learned that lesson early. Instead, they made high-speed passes, fired, then climbed back to altitude using their superior power. The Zeros tried to turn into each attack, tried to bring their superior maneuverability to bear. But you can't outturn an enemy who won't turn with you. Sakai watched as another Zero exploded, hit by a Hellcat that had dove from above, fired a single burst, and was already climbing away before the wreckage hit the water. That was 3 Japanese fighters down in as many minutes. "Sakai-san, behind you." Yamamoto's warning came just in time. Sakai broke hard right, looking back over his shoulder to see a Hellcat closing from his 6 o'clock. The American pilot had patience. He wasn't firing from maximum range, wasn't wasting ammunition. He was closing to point-blank range where his 6 machine guns would be absolutely devastating. At 300 yards, Sakai pulled his Zero into the tightest possible turn, bleeding off speed, forcing the Hellcat pilot to make a choice: follow into a slow-speed turning fight where the Zero had advantage, or maintain speed and break off. The American chose to break off, pulling up and away, but he'd been a fraction of a second too committed to the attack. As the Hellcat passed through Sakai's sights at nearly 90 degrees deflection, Sakai fired. It was an impossible shot. 90 degrees deflection at 300 yards. Both aircraft in maximum performance turns, closure speed over 600 miles per hour. Sakai fired anyway, leading the Hellcat by what looked like 3 aircraft lengths, trusting instinct developed through thousands of hours of flight time and hundreds of combat engagements. 3 20mm shells hit the Hellcat's right wing. Not a killing blow. The Hellcat was built tough, designed to take punishment that would destroy a Zero. But the shells damaged the aileron control, and suddenly the American pilot was fighting his aircraft. He rolled wings level and dove away, trailing light smoke, heading for his carrier with degraded flight controls but probably survivable damage. "1 damaged," Sakai transmitted, knowing that damaged wouldn't count as a kill, wouldn't appear in any official tally, but satisfied that he'd hurt one of them at least. The dive bombers, meanwhile, had continued to their target. Sakai could see them in the distance, pushing over into their attack dives, their split air brakes deploying as they plummeted toward the Japanese ships in Simpson Harbor. Anti-aircraft fire created black puffs around them, but the Americans flew through it with the discipline of well-trained crews. "All aircraft, regroup and land," Saito's voice came over the radio, carrying the exhaustion of a commander who'd just watched his squadron get mauled. "We can't stop them. Save your ammunition and fuel for tomorrow." Tomorrow. There was always tomorrow. And the day after. And the day after that. Sakai landed at Rabaul 30 minutes later, his Zero's engine overheating from the combat throttle settings, his hands cramping from the sustained G-forces. Of the 18 Zeros that had taken off, 12 returned, 6 aircraft lost, 6 pilots dead, including Tanaka, a kid who'd been flying for less than 3 months, who'd written letters to his mother in Nagoya every week, who'd shown Sakai photographs of his younger sister and talked about teaching her to fly after the war. The interrogation officer was waiting in the operations tent. A young lieutenant named Ishikawa, who'd never flown combat, but was responsible for compiling victory claims and loss reports. "Report your engagement, Sakai-san." "1 SBD Dauntless destroyed. Departed formation trailing smoke with structural damage. 1 F-6F Hellcat damaged. Hit in wing. Last seen departing combat area under control, but damaged. 1-0 from my division destroyed. Pilot killed. Flight Petty Officer Tanaka." Ishikawa wrote this down carefully. "Other claims from your division?" "Flight Petty Officer Okabe claims hits on 1 SBD, but I did not observe the result. Flight Warrant Officer Yamamoto fired on several aircraft, but scored no confirmed hits." "The squadron total," Ishikawa said, consulting his notes from other pilots, "is 3 SBDs destroyed, 2 Hellcats destroyed, 4 Hellcats damaged. The Americans dropped their bombs on our shipping. 2 cargo vessels damaged, 1 destroyer hit, but still operational." Sakai did the mathematics in his head. 6 Japanese Zeros lost, 3 SBDs and 2 Hellcats destroyed. If the claims were accurate, which they probably weren't, maybe they'd actually destroyed 2 dive bombers and 1 fighter. Maybe. And tomorrow, the Americans would come again, with fresh aircraft replacing their losses, while the Japanese squadron was down to 12 operational fighters. He walked to his quarters, a wooden hut shared with 5 other pilots, and lay down on his bunk without removing his flight suit. The overhead fan stirred the humid air without cooling it. Outside, ground crews were working on the surviving Zeros, patching holes, replacing damaged components, preparing for tomorrow's mission. At 1800 hours, a messenger found Sakai and told him Lieutenant Commander Saito wanted to see him. Sakai walked to the command post, a fortified bunker near the flight line, where Saito was studying a captured American document that intelligence had delivered that afternoon. "Sakai-san, sit down." Saito's voice carried a weariness that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. "I want to show you something. This was taken from an SBD that crashed 2 days ago. The pilot and gunner were killed, but their aircraft was relatively intact. We found this in the cockpit." He handed Sakai a mimeographed document, slightly water-stained but readable. It was a squadron roster for VB-17, a dive bomber squadron operating from USS Bunker Hill. Sakai read it slowly, his English learned during training adequate for technical documents. The roster listed 36 pilots in the squadron. Next to each name was their flight time: 525 hours for the squadron commander, 480 hours for the executive officer, ranging down to 415 hours for the most junior pilot. Every single pilot had more flight time than Tanaka had possessed when he died today. Most had more flight time than Okabe or Yamamoto. Some had more flight time than Sakai himself had possessed when he first saw combat in China. But that wasn't what made Saito show him the document. At the bottom of the roster, in handwritten pencil, someone had written, "Replacement pilots arriving 10 December 12 pilots, AVG, 450 HRs, Hellcat qualified. 12 replacement pilots, arriving in 3 days. 12. Sakai read it twice to make sure he understood. This single American squadron is receiving 12 replacement pilots in one batch? That's correct. They're receiving 12 pilots to replace. How many losses? According to our intelligence, VB-17 has lost perhaps 4 aircraft in the past month. So they're not even replacing combat losses. They're expanding their squadron strength. Saito pulled out another document, this one from Japanese Naval Intelligence. This is our pilot replacement schedule for the entire Southeast Area Air Force, which includes Rabaul, Bougainville, and the Northern Solomons. For December 1943, we are scheduled to receive 23 replacement pilots. 23 pilots for 15 squadrons across the entire theater. That's 1.5 pilots per squadron. The numbers settled over Sakai like a physical weight. One American dive bomber squadron was receiving 12 replacement pilots in a single delivery. The entire Japanese Southeast Area Air Force was receiving 23 pilots for the entire month, distributed across 15 squadrons. How many pilots are they training? Sakai asked quietly. We don't know exactly. Interrogated POWs say they're graduating thousands monthly from their training programs. Thousands. One American pilot we captured last month said he trained alongside 300 other students at Pensacola, and that was just one training facility. They have dozens of such facilities. Saito stood and walked to the wall map showing the Pacific Theater. Today, we shot down maybe 3 of their aircraft. Let's be generous and say 5. 5 aircraft destroyed, and in 3 days, VB-17 alone will receive 12 replacement pilots flying brand new aircraft. We can't kill them fast enough to matter. Sakai looked at the captured roster again, studying the names. Lieutenant James Morrison, 525 hours. Lieutenant J.G. Robert Chen, 480 hours. Ensign William Jackson, 445 hours. These weren't hastily trained replacements thrown into combat with minimal preparation. These were fully qualified pilots with more training than most Japanese veterans. The pilot I shot down today, Sakai said. The SBD that I hit. The gunner kept firing even as the aircraft was going down. Disciplined, well-trained, not some replacement who panicked. And tomorrow, they'll send someone just as good to replace him. Yes, Saito said simply. That's exactly right. They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the distant sound of generators and the evening chorus of tropical insects. On the wall, the map showed Japanese territory spanning thousands of miles, from Burma to the Gilbert Islands, from the Kuriles to New Guinea. It looked impressive, an empire dominating the Pacific. But Sakai now understood that the map was a lie. Territory meant nothing if you couldn't defend it. Bases meant nothing if you couldn't supply them with pilots and aircraft. Admiral Yamamoto knew, Sakai said. Before Pearl Harbor, he warned them. He said if we didn't win quickly, America's industrial capacity would overwhelm us. No one listened. Some listened, Saito replied. But by the time you realize you're in a war you can't win, it's too late to not be in that war. At 0600 hours the next morning, December 8th, Sakai was back in his Zero's cockpit, preparing for another interception mission. American bombers were coming again. They always came. And today, Sakai would try to shoot down as many as possible, knowing that every aircraft he destroyed would be replaced within days by the endless stream of pilots graduating from American training programs. Flight Petty Officer Okabe climbed into his Zero in the revetment next to Sakai's. The young pilot had survived yesterday's combat, which meant he was learning. Maybe he'd survive another week, maybe even a month. Japanese pilots who lived long enough became skilled through sheer experience, but most didn't live long enough. The mathematics were merciless. Sakai was one of Japan's best pilots. 28 confirmed victories, dozens more probables, 5 years of combat experience, hundreds of hours of flight time. and he'd shot down 2 American aircraft yesterday while losing 1 pilot from his division. Even at his exceptional skill level, the exchange rate barely broke even. Average Japanese pilots weren't winning their engagements. They were dying, and they were being replaced by pilots with 100 hours of training facing Americans with 525 hours of training. The outcome was predetermined by simple arithmetic. As Sakai started his engine and began the taxi to the runway, he thought about the captured roster sitting on Saito's desk. 12 replacement pilots arriving in 3 days. 12 pilots who would fight for VB-17, who would fly combat missions over Rabaul, who would drop bombs on Japanese ships. How many of those 12 would Sakai face in combat? How many would survive long enough to become veterans themselves? And more importantly, when those 12 were shot down or rotated home, how many more would America send to replace them? The answer, Sakai now understood, was as many as necessary. America would send 12, then 12 more, then 12 more after that, for as long as the war continued. They would send pilots faster than Japan could kill them, in aircraft produced faster than Japan could destroy them, backed by an industrial machine that treated pilot training as a production problem to be solved through standardization and scale. Sakai lined up on the runway and advanced his throttle to full power. The Zero accelerated, its lightweight and powerful engine lifting it off the coral runway in less than 300 feet. He climbed into the morning sky, heading toward another interception, another combat, another day of shooting down Americans who would be replaced before their bodies were buried. Somewhere over the Pacific, 12 replacement pilots were flying toward USS Bunker Hill, ready to join VB-17. Somewhere in Florida, California, and Texas, thousands more were in training, learning to fly, preparing to come west. The pipeline never stopped. The production never slowed, and no amount of Japanese courage or skill could stop it. That was the truth Sakai had learned. Not that American pilots were better. They weren't, not individually. Not that American aircraft were superior, though increasingly they were. The truth was simpler and more devastating. America trained pilots faster than Japan could kill them. And in a war of attrition, that difference decided everything. The pattern Sakai witnessed at Rabaul in late 1943 repeated itself across every theater of the Pacific War, accelerating through 1944 until the disparity in pilot quality became so extreme that conventional air combat ceased to be viable for Japan. The mathematics of attrition, invisible in individual battles, but overwhelming across time, manifested in ways that no amount of courage or tactical innovation could overcome. In the Marianas in June 1944, Vice Admiral Saburo Ozawa led the Mobile fleet into what he believed would be a decisive carrier battle. His 9 carriers embarked 473 aircraft, a force that represented nearly every operational carrier aircraft Japan possessed. Opposing him, Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58 fielded 15 carriers with over 900 aircraft. But the numbers alone didn't tell the full story. Flight Petty Officer Zenji Abe, flying from Carrier Taiho in the first wave of Japanese attacks on June 19th, had graduated from flight training just 4 months earlier, with 95 hours total flight time. His carrier landing qualifications consisted of 6 successful traps. In peacetime, pilots needed 50 successful carrier landings before being considered fully qualified. Abe had fired exactly 40 practice rounds from his aircraft's guns, and those had been fired at a stationary target, not a maneuvering fighter. Opposing him were pilots like Ensign Robert Duncan from USS Yorktown's VF-1 Squadron, who had 615 hours total flight time, including 240 hours in the F-6F Hellcat. Duncan had fired over 6,000 practice rounds in training, completed 57 carrier landings, and spent 3 weeks at a replacement air group facility specifically practicing tactics against simulated enemy fighters. He'd even participated in mock combat against captured Japanese aircraft, learning their strengths and limitations before ever seeing combat. The Battle of the Philippine Sea lasted 2 days and became known to American pilots as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a name that captured the lopsided nature of the engagement. Of the 373 Japanese aircraft launched in the initial strike on June 19th, 346 were destroyed. American losses that day: 23 aircraft. The exchange rate wasn't 3-1 or even 5-1. It was 15-1. 15 Japanese aircraft lost for every American fighter destroyed. And the disparity wasn't caused by equipment. While the F-6F Hellcat was superior to the Zero, the difference wasn't enough to explain such lopsided results. The disparity came from training. Commander David McCampbell, leading the fighter direction from USS Essex, watched the massacre unfold on his radar screen. They came in straight and level, perfect radar targets. They didn't vary altitude or use clouds for cover. They maintained formation when they should have scattered. It was like they'd been trained for a different war. They had been trained for a different war. The war of 1941 to 1942, when Japanese pilot quality and aircraft performance gave them consistent victories. But that war was over. The pilots Japan sent to the Philippine Sea weren't the veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean raids. Most of those veterans were dead. The new pilots were rushed through abbreviated training programs with insufficient flight time, inadequate gunnery practice, and almost no tactical instruction beyond basic formation flying. Flight Warrant Officer Kiyoshi Endo, one of the few survivors of the Philippine Sea disaster, was interrogated after being pulled from the water by an American destroyer. His testimony, recorded by U.S. Naval Intelligence, revealed the extent of Japanese training collapse. "I trained for 7 months. Most of that was ground school, navigation, aircraft recognition, radio procedure. I had 85 hours in the air, total, 40 hours in a trainer, 45 in the Zero. I fired my guns twice in training, maybe 200 rounds total. I made 8 carrier landings before being assigned to Zuikaku. My first combat mission was June 19th, Philippine Sea. I was shot down 17 minutes after finding the American fleet. I never fired my guns in combat. A Hellcat came from above and behind, and I didn't see him until his bullets hit my aircraft. 85 hours training, 8 carrier landings, 200 practice rounds, 17 minutes of combat. The numbers told a story of systemic failure. A training system that had once produced the finest naval aviators in the world, now producing barely qualified pilots who died before they could learn from their mistakes. The American pilots noticed the difference immediately. Lieutenant J.G. Alexander Vrachu, who would shoot down 6 Japanese aircraft in a single mission during the Philippine Sea battle, described the opposition. "They flew like students, predictable, no evasive action. When I got behind one, he tried to turn, exactly what they taught us not to do when facing a Hellcat. I gave him a 2-second burst, and he came apart. Then his wingman did the exact same thing. It was like shooting targets at gunnery practice." By October 1944, the situation had deteriorated further. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Japan committed its remaining carrier strength, 4 carriers with 116 aircraft, the last operational carrier air groups in the Imperial Navy. These carriers served primarily as decoys, their air groups so depleted and undertrained that they were considered expendable. Lieutenant Ryoji Ohara, one of the few experienced pilots remaining in the Japanese carrier force, led a section of Zero fighters from carrier Zuikaku during the battle. His post-war testimony revealed the desperation. Of the 6 pilots in my division, I was the only one with more than 100 hours flight time. The youngest had 63 hours. 63! In 1941, that would have been barely enough to graduate from basic training. Now, we were sending them into combat against American carrier groups. The mission was a disaster. Of the 116 Japanese carrier aircraft committed to the battle, fewer than 30 returned to their carriers. And those carriers would never again conduct flight operations. Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda were all sunk by American aircraft during the battle. The Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier aviation capability, which had started the war as the most powerful in the world, effectively ceased to exist on October 25, 1944. The response to this training and experience disparity was as desperate as it was telling. On October 25th, the same day the last Japanese carriers sank off Cape Engano, Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi stood before a group of 26 Zero pilots at Mabalacat Air Base in the Philippines and asked for volunteers for a special attack mission. Not a regular attack mission, but Tokubetsu Kogekitai, special attack units. Kamikazes. Japan faces a crisis, Onishi told the assembled pilots. Our conventional tactics are no longer effective against American defenses. Their fighter pilots are too numerous, too well trained, their defenses too strong. But if we use our aircraft as weapons, crashing them into enemy ships, each pilot can sink a carrier with certainty. One life, one ship. This is our path to victory. The logic was brutal, but mathematically sound. If Japanese pilots couldn't survive long enough in conventional combat to achieve significant results, perhaps suicide attacks could achieve better exchange rates. A pilot with 60 hours training couldn't dogfight a Hellcat pilot with 600 hours training. But that same undertrained pilot could dive his explosive-laden aircraft into a ship's deck, requiring no specialized skills, no gunnery accuracy, no complex tactics. Lieutenant Yukio Seki, selected to lead the first organized kamikaze unit, understood the implications better than most. He told a reporter before his final mission, "Japan's situation is desperate. We are being asked to do this because our training can no longer compete with American pilot training. If we could fight conventionally and win, we would. But we can't. So we do this." The kamikaze strategy was an admission that Japan could no longer train pilots to competitive standards. It was an acknowledgement that the training pipeline had broken down so completely that suicide was more effective than attempting conventional combat. And it was a terrible confirmation that Sakai and others had been right. You couldn't win a war when your enemy trained pilots faster than you could kill them. The effectiveness of kamikaze attacks varied, but the desperation they represented was absolute. Between October 1944 and August 1945, approximately 3,860 kamikaze sorties were flown. They sank 34 ships and damaged 368 others, a significant toll, but not enough to alter the war's outcome. And the cost was unsustainable. 3,860 pilots killed in 10 months, with no possibility of those pilots gaining experience, returning to training commands, or contributing to future operations. Lieutenant Commander John Thack, observing kamikaze attacks from USS Bunker Hill, recognized what they represented. When an enemy resorts to suicide attacks, it means they've lost the ability to fight conventionally. They're not doing this from strength. They're doing it from desperation. They've admitted their pilots can't compete with ours in normal combat, so they're trading certain death for possible damage. It's effective in the short term, but strategically, it's an admission of defeat. By early 1945, the training disparity had become so extreme that American fighter pilots felt almost guilty about the easy victories. Ensign Robert Duncan, now a veteran with 12 kills, described a mission over Okinawa in April 1945. We intercepted a group of Val dive bombers with Zero escorts. The Zeros tried to defend the bombers, but they flew like rank beginners. One got on my tail but couldn't maintain his position. He kept sliding outside my turn. I slowed down to give him a chance to shoot at me, but he still couldn't achieve a firing solution. Finally, I reversed, got behind him, and shot him down. It felt like murder, not combat. The statistics from the final months of the war were even more lopsided than the Philippine Sea. In the last 8 months of the war, the U.S. Navy lost exactly 2 dive bombers and 5 torpedo planes in aerial combat. Not 2 squadrons, 2 individual aircraft. Japanese losses in the same period exceeded 3,000 aircraft. The exchange rate had become so extreme that it ceased to be combat and became massacre. Japanese training had collapsed entirely by spring 1945. Flight Petty Officer Saburo Endo, who would survive the war to be interviewed decades later, described his training in May 1945. 6 weeks total. 4 weeks ground school, 2 weeks flying. 20 hours in a trainer, 15 hours in the Zero. I never fired the guns. I never practiced tactics. I made 3 carrier landings on a practice carrier at Tokushima. Then they sent me to Kyushu to defend against the invasion. I was told to crash into any American ship I saw. That was my entire tactical instruction. Crash into ships. 20 hours in a trainer. 15 hours in the Zero. No gunnery training. No tactical training. 3 carrier landings. This pilot was supposed to defend Japan against Task Force 58, which now regularly fielded over 1,000 carrier aircraft flown by pilots averaging 600+ hours of training. The American training pipeline, meanwhile, continued operating at full capacity. In early 1945, with victory clearly in sight, the Navy was still graduating over 1,500 pilots monthly. These pilots accumulated 525+ hours before reaching the fleet, practiced gunnery against towed targets, studied gun camera film from actual combat, and trained in replacement air groups using actual combat veterans as instructors. Lieutenant Commander Sakai, evacuated from Rabaul to Japan in January 1944, after his injuries made continued combat flying impossible, was assigned to Yokosuka Air Group as a training instructor. Standing in front of a class of student pilots in March 1945, he looked at faces that seemed impossibly young and understood exactly what he was sending them to face. "How many hours has the class averaged?" Sakai asked the training commander after the session. 43 hours per student. We've run out of fuel for extended training. We have the aircraft, but no avgas. These students will go to their units with perhaps 60 hours total when they complete the program. 60 hours. Sakai had possessed 300 hours when he first saw combat in China. These students had 1/5 that training and would face American pilots with 10 times their experience. "What do I teach them?" Sakai asked. "How do I prepare them to fight pilots with 600 hours of training when my students have 60 hours?" The training commander had no answer. There was no answer. You couldn't teach in 60 hours what American pilots learned in 525 hours. You couldn't create experienced pilots through force of will when you had no fuel for practice, no ammunition for gunnery training, no time for tactics. Teach them to crash into the Americans, the commander finally said. That's all we can ask of them now. Teach them to die effectively. Sakai refused that assignment. He taught his students everything he could in the limited time available: energy management, deflection shooting theory, mutual support tactics, emergency procedures. Whether any of it would help them survive more than one combat mission, he doubted. But he taught them anyway, because that was all he could do. In June 1945, the last Japanese training class before the war's end graduated 89 pilots with an average of 55 hours training. That same month, American training programs graduated 247 pilots with an average of 530 hours training. The ratio was 23-1 in numbers, 10-1 in training hours. The mathematics were beyond overwhelming. They were apocalyptic. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, the U.S. Navy had over 40,000 qualified pilots, more pilots than Japan had trained in the entire war. America had pilots waiting at training commands for aircraft that weren't built yet. Japan had aircraft sitting on the ground, with no pilots qualified to fly them. The training disparity that had seemed manageable in 1942 had become absolute by 1945. What started as Japan training one pilot for every 3 American pilots had become Japan training one barely qualified pilot for every 23 fully trained American pilots. The war ended not because Japan ran out of aircraft or fuel or ships, though all were scarce, but because Japan ran out of trained pilots and had no way to produce them fast enough to matter. Sakai survived the war with 64 official victories, though he never confirmed that number himself, making him one of Japan's top aces. He lived to age 84, attending air shows and reunions, meeting with former American adversaries, reflecting on a war that had been lost before it truly began. In a 1998 interview, asked about the key to American victory, his answer was simple. You trained pilots. We trained heroes. Heroes die magnificently, but they still die. You trained enough pilots that when one died, 2 more arrived to replace him. That's how you win wars. We never understood that until it was too late. The numbers that defined the Pacific Air War's outcome were written not in combat reports, but in graduation certificates from training programs that operated thousands of miles from any battlefield. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States Navy graduated 61,658 pilots from its training programs. In that same period, the Imperial Japanese Navy graduated approximately 15,000 pilots across all training programs combined. The ratio, 4 American pilots trained for every Japanese pilot, told only part of the story. The quality differential told the rest. Each of those 61,658 American naval aviators completed a standardized program averaging 525 hours of flight time before operational assignment. They fired thousands of practice rounds at towed targets. They flew in formation until coordination became instinctive. They practiced carrier landings until the approach became muscle memory. They studied tactics with instructors who'd survived combat tours and returned to share their knowledge. The 15,000 Japanese pilots graduated with training times that declined precipitously as the war progressed. Early war graduates received 300-plus hours and 2 years of instruction. By 1943, that had dropped to 100 to 120 hours. By 1945, some pilots graduated with as little as 40 to 60 hours total flight time. They fired limited practice ammunition due to shortages. They flew abbreviated training syllabi due to fuel constraints. And critically, Their instructors were increasingly inexperienced. The best pilots stayed in combat units until they died, rather than being rotated to training commands to pass on their knowledge. The systematic difference in approach manifested most clearly in pilot rotation policies. The U.S. Navy instituted a rotation system in 1943 that pulled combat pilots from the front lines after completing a tour, typically 6 to 12 months, or a set number of missions. These veterans returned to the United States to serve as instructors, test pilots, or staff officers. They trained the next generation, sharing lessons learned in combat, demonstrating tactics that worked, and warning about mistakes that killed. Japan had no such rotation system. Pilots fought until they died, were too injured to continue, or the war ended. This maximized short-term combat effectiveness. Every experienced pilot remained at the front, where their skills had maximum impact. But it catastrophically undermined long-term capability. When veteran pilots died, their knowledge died with them. New pilots arrived at combat units with no experienced mentors, learned on the job if they survived, and died before accumulating enough experience to become effective trainers themselves. Lieutenant Commander Edward "Butch" O'Hare exemplified the American approach. After becoming America's first naval ace of the war, with 5 kills in a single mission in February 1942, O'Hare was pulled from combat and sent on a war bonds tour of the United States. He trained new pilots, consulted on tactical development, tested new aircraft, and shared his combat experience with hundreds of students. When he returned to combat in 1943, those hundreds of students were already fighting in the Pacific, using tactics O'Hare had taught them. O'Hare himself died in combat in November 1943, but his knowledge survived in the pilots he'd trained. Warrant Officer Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, Japan's most successful ace with over 100 victories, represented the Japanese approach. From 1942 until his death in October 1944, Nishizawa flew continuous combat without rotation. His skills were legendary. American pilots called him the Devil for his uncanny ability to evade their attacks. But when Nishizawa died as a passenger in a transport aircraft shot down by American fighters, his combat knowledge died with him. He'd never been pulled from combat to train new pilots. His tactical innovations existed only in his own mind. The hundreds of hours of experience that could have been shared with student pilots evaporated when his transport crashed into the sea. The economic calculus was brutal but decisive. America treated pilots as valuable resources to be preserved, developed, and efficiently utilized. Japan treated pilots as expendable weapons to be used until they broke. In the short term, Japan's approach maximized current combat power. In the long term, it guaranteed defeat. By war's end, the disparity had become absolute. American training programs were still graduating over 1,000 pilots monthly in August 1945. Instructors at Pensacola were teaching students who would never see combat because the war would end before they completed training. Training aircraft sat idle at auxiliary fields because there were more aircraft than students. The system had reached such efficient scale that it could have continued indefinitely, producing pilots faster than combat could consume them. Japan's training programs had collapsed entirely. Fuel shortages meant students received 10 to 20 hours per month of flight time instead of the 40 to 50 hours necessary for effective learning. Instructors were increasingly young pilots with barely more experience than their students. Aircraft shortages meant students shared trainers, waiting days between flights. The last training classes before surrender graduated pilots who'd never fired their guns in training, never practiced carrier landings, never flew in formation. The human cost of this training disparity extended beyond battle deaths. American pilots who survived their tours returned home with psychological support systems, veterans' benefits, and a nation that honored their service. Many transitioned to civilian aviation careers, using their extensive training to become airline pilots, flight instructors, or test pilots. The investment in their training paid dividends long after the war ended. Japanese pilots who survived, a tiny minority, returned to a defeated nation with no aviation industry, no commercial flying opportunities, and often no recognition of their service. Sakai worked odd jobs for years before finding stable employment. Many veteran pilots struggled with PTSD without any support system. Some committed suicide, unable to reconcile their wartime experiences with peacetime reality. The knowledge and skills they developed at such cost to their nation had no post-war application. In September 1945, at Atsugi Air Base outside Tokyo, Lieutenant Commander Sakai stood among the wreckage of Japanese aviation. American occupation forces had ordered all Japanese military aircraft destroyed. Zeros, training aircraft, even experimental prototypes were being cut apart with torches. Their aluminum melted down for scrap. Mechanics who'd kept these aircraft flying through years of combat now destroyed them with tears running down their faces. A young American lieutenant approached Sakai, clipboard in hand. "Lieutenant Commander Sakai, I'm Lieutenant Robert Morrison, U.S. Navy. I've been assigned to interview Japanese aviators about your training programs and combat experience. Would you be willing to talk?" Sakai agreed, and over the next 3 hours, answered Morrison's questions about Japanese pilot training, tactics, and logistics. Morrison took extensive notes, particularly interested in the training hour statistics. "You had 300 hours when you first saw combat?" Morrison asked, sounding surprised. "That's less than half what our pilots receive now. But you were considered well-trained?" "In 1938, 300 hours was excellent training," Sakai replied. "I spent 2 years in flight school. The Navy selected perhaps 1 in 10 applicants. We learned aerobatics, gunnery, navigation, everything. By the time I reached China, I could fly the aircraft instinctively." "And by 1945? Sakai's voice grew quiet. "By 1945, we were graduating pilots with 60 hours. They couldn't fly instinctively. They could barely fly at all. We sent them to die against your pilots, who had 600 hours training." He paused. "You won the war in your training fields, Lieutenant. Not over Rabaul or the Philippine Sea. Those battles just confirmed what was already decided when you trained 20,000 pilots annually, and we trained 3,000. Morrison closed his notebook. "Sir, I read your combat record. 64 victories officially claimed, though you say the actual number is uncertain. You survived the entire war. You're one of Japan's greatest aces. How did you lose?" Sakai gestured at the destroyed aircraft around them, at the mechanics cutting apart Zeros that had fought from Pearl Harbor to the home islands. "We lost because courage isn't enough. Skill isn't enough. We had brave pilots and good tactics and excellent aircraft. But you had unlimited pilots. You trained them faster than we could kill them. You rotated veterans home to train more pilots while we kept ours in combat until they died. You treated pilot training as an industrial process that could be scaled. We treated it as an art that couldn't be rushed." He stood and walked to where workers were dismantling a Zero that bore the tail number 51132, his own aircraft, the fighter he'd flown through dozens of combats. "Every week at Rabaul, we shot down American aircraft. Good kills, confirmed victories. And every week, More Americans appeared than we'd shot down the week before. Where were they coming from? Your training programs. Thousands of pilots learning to fly, learning to fight, waiting for their chance to come west. Morrison watched as mechanics cut through the Zero's tail section. What would you have done differently if you could change Japan's pilot training program? Sakai considered the question carefully. Train more pilots with adequate training rather than fewer pilots with excellent training. Rotate combat veterans to training commands even if it weakened frontline units temporarily. Except that in modern warfare, pilot production is as important as aircraft production. Understand that America's industrial capacity extended beyond factories. It included training facilities that could graduate 20,000 pilots annually while maintaining quality standards. He paused, then added, but most importantly, don't start a war with a nation that has unlimited resources, unlimited industrial capacity, and the organizational ability to train pilots like they build automobiles. Admiral Yamamoto told us this before Pearl Harbor. We should have listened. The statistics supported Sakai's assessment with brutal clarity. Total pilot losses during the Pacific War. Japan lost approximately 80% of its trained pilots, roughly 12,000 pilots killed in action out of 15,000 trained. America lost approximately 27% of its trained pilots, roughly 16,000 pilots killed in action out of 61,658 trained. Japan lost a higher percentage of pilots from a much smaller pool, creating a death spiral that ensured defeat. More significantly, American pilots who died were replaced within weeks by fully trained graduates from the pipeline. Japanese pilots who died were irreplaceable. By late 1944, Japan was putting pilots in combat with 40 to 60 hours training because that was all the fuel and time allowed. These pilots had a life expectancy measured in hours of combat flying. Most died in their first 5 missions. The few who survived long enough to become competent were killed before they could become veterans. The lessons learned from this training disparity influenced military aviation doctrine worldwide. Modern air forces universally adopted the American model. Large-scale training programs producing high volumes of adequately trained pilots. Systematic rotation of combat veterans to training commands. Standardized curricula emphasizing teamwork over individual skill. And recognition that pilot training infrastructure is as strategically important as aircraft production capacity. The U.S. Navy's pilot training system from World War II became the template for NATO, for post-war Japanese self-defense forces, for modern air forces globally. The Japanese system, highly selective, extended training times, focus on individual excellence, was abandoned as strategically unsustainable in modern warfare. December 7, 1998. Exactly 57 years after Pearl Harbor. Sakai sat in his Tokyo home, now 82 years old, being interviewed by an American historian researching Pacific air combat. The historian showed him statistics comparing American and Japanese pilot training programs, numbers Sakai had never seen compiled in one document. These numbers, the historian said, show that America trained 61,058 naval aviators during the war. Japan trained approximately 15,000. The average American pilot had 525 hours before combat assignment. The average Japanese pilot, by 1944, had less than 100 hours. Looking at these numbers now, was the outcome ever in doubt? Sakai studied the statistics for a long time before answering. I remember standing at Rabaul in November 1943, watching Lieutenant Commander Saito show me a captured American squadron roster. 12 replacement pilots arriving in 3 days for a single dive bomber squadron. 12 pilots to replace losses that hadn't even occurred yet. Meanwhile, our entire Southeast Area Air Force received 23 replacement pilots for the whole month, spread across 15 squadrons. He pointed at the training numbers. That was when I understood. Not that we were losing. We'd lost at Midway, lost at Guadalcanal, seen our carriers sunk and our best pilots killed. But standing at Rabaul, seeing those numbers, I understood why we were losing. You were training pilots faster than we could kill them. Not slightly faster. Overwhelmingly faster. 4 American pilots trained for every Japanese pilot. And those American pilots had 5 times the training hours our late war pilots received. So the outcome was inevitable? From the moment we attacked Pearl Harbor, yes. We might have negotiated peace in 1942, might have kept some of our conquests. But in a long war? Sakai shook his head. Admiral Yamamoto was right. He warned us that America's industrial capacity would overwhelm us. That capacity wasn't just factories building aircraft. It was training facilities building pilots. We never understood that pilot production mattered as much as aircraft production. The historian closed his notebook. You shot down 64 American aircraft officially, probably more unofficially. You survived the entire war. By any measure, you were one of Japan's greatest pilots. But you're saying individual skill didn't matter? It mattered, Sakai replied, but not enough. I was one pilot. America sent thousands. I had 300 hours training before my first combat. Your pilots in 1944 had 525 hours. I flew for 5 years before I was too wounded to continue. Most Japanese pilots died in their first month. Your pilots rotated home after a tour, trained new pilots, then came back for another tour. You multiplied your effectiveness. We subtracted from ours. He walked to his window, looking out at the Tokyo skyline, where American aircraft no longer flew bombing missions, but where Japanese industry now built cars and electronics. We shot Americans down every week. I personally killed dozens of your pilots. Good pilots, brave men. But they came by the hundreds to replace the dozens we killed. That's the lesson. In modern warfare, industrial capacity determines victory, and industrial capacity includes pilot training. You understood that. We didn't. That's why you won. Sakai died in September 2000, suffering a heart attack while shaking hands with an American Navy officer at Atsugi Naval Air Station, the same base where he'd watched Zeros being destroyed 55 years earlier. He was 84 years old, one of the last surviving Japanese aces, a man who'd fought with honor against overwhelming odds and lived long enough to understand exactly why those odds had been overwhelming. The final testimony to American pilot training superiority came not from statistics or battle reports, but from the lasting impact on air combat doctrine. Every modern Air Force trains pilots using methods derived from the U.S. Navy's World War II program. Standardized curricula, high training hours, teamwork emphasis, veteran instructor cadres, and recognition that pilot production infrastructure is strategic capability. The Japanese model, selective entry, extended training times, individual excellence focus, exists only in history books as an example of what not to do. Lieutenant Commander Sakai had stood at Rabaul in November 1943, looking at captured rosters showing American replacement pilots arriving by the dozen, understanding for the first time that courage and skill couldn't overcome mathematics. He'd spent the next 57 years reflecting on that realization, teaching it to anyone who would listen, warning future generations that wars are won in training fields before the first shot is fired. The mathematics were merciless. The conclusion was inevitable. And standing at Rabaul that November morning, watching ground crews prepare Zeros for missions against an enemy that replaced pilots faster than Japan could kill them, Sakai had glimpsed the truth that would define the Pacific War's outcome. You couldn't defeat an enemy who trained 20,000 pilots annually when you trained 3,000. You couldn't win when their pilots had 525 hours training and yours had 60 hours. You couldn't fight American industrial capacity, applied to pilot training as effectively as aircraft production, and expect victory. Japan shot Americans down every week. America sent replacements by the dozens. That was the war. That was how America won. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications.